Well, welcome everyone. It's great to welcome you back to our third Walter Rodney seminar of the fall semester. It's great to welcome John Thornton, who's a professor here at BU in the History Department and African American Studies program, as well as the African Studies program. John's primarily an Africanist who has a specialization in the history of West Central Africa before 1800. He's written a number of books dealing with the Kingdom of Congo, Atlantic history. His most recent book being the History of West Central Africa to 1850 that came out with Cambridge University Press earlier this year. But I think the biggest news that we all really enjoy celebrating about John is that he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences earlier this year, along with Linda Haywood. So congratulations, John. Welcome. And I'm going to turn things over to you in just a second, but just for anyone who hasn't been to our new virtual Rodney format, we're going to go ahead and let John speak for about 45 minutes or however long you have. And then at the end, we'll take questions, which you can either submit via the Q&A feature on the sort of the button down on the bottom of your screen. You can type a question there, and then I will be sort of fielding those for John so he doesn't have to deal with the technical side of things. You can alternatively raise your hand and I can call on you and unmute you so you can speak your questions as well. And if you have any technical issues or whatever, the chat feature is also enabled so we can see your comments during the presentation. So John, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to rapidly here share my screen. Okay, so, well, you can see that the topic of my talk is the expansion of Lunda. And what I'm going to try to do is I hope to break utterly and completely the paradigm of explanations for why the Lunda Empire expanded as it did in the 18th century. And this is, you might say, a takeaway from my new book. So this book was, as you can see from the title, a really prosaic title, likely to put it on the bestseller list, is in fact a sort of a narrative-driven history, pulling together basically 40 years worth of research that I've done here and there and the other place. And I used to call it my guilt book because I was sitting all this data and I wasn't publishing it. So I said, okay, I'm just going to throw this all into one place. And well, it's a little bit less haphazard than that. But so this is the result. And unfortunately, when you use that type of a narrative framework, it's harder to make arguments about individual parts of it. The argument I'm presenting to you today is in the book, but it may not be so visible because there's not any historiographical introductions and that kind of stuff. A lot of the technical stuff is pushed down into footnotes. But in any case, this is what we're talking about, the Lunda Empire. This is my hand-drawn map, which has been reproduced professionally in the book. And I always like my hand-drawn maps better than the book maps. So this is my hand. You can see my little JKT down here at the bottom. So here's the Lunda Empire in 1850, more or less at its height. It's about 500 kilometers this way, and 500 kilometers that way. And the capital is almost exactly in the middle of the southern portion of West Central Africa, of Africa. So it's like really literally the heart of the continent. And the Lunda Empire was, as you can imagine, a major power. It has a huge surface area, although granted, not particularly densely populated. And it was very much of a force across the whole continent. For example, in 1806, Pedro João Batista and Amaro José, two pombeiros or African merchants in the service of the Portuguese factor Cassange, crossed the continent twice. They went from west to east and they went west to east over to Mozambique, and then they came back east to west. And when they returned in 1811, there was an inquiry into their trip to find out what they'd learned. And they were asked a number of questions about what it was like to travel through the Lunda Empire. And they said, basically, we had no problems at all. They asked, were there bandits? No bandits, no dissent anywhere. Were the roads good? The roads were always really good. Did you have trouble finding food? They said everywhere there was a village, they had a stopping place for people passing through. When there was an area that was unsettled, the authorities would warn them that was there, and they had provisions for them to take extra stuff on to travel. In other words, it was very much sort of a pax lundica, if I can quote such a term. And that's sort of the way it was. Now, unfortunately for us, In the 1860s, Lunda began a long and extensive civil war, which really tore it to pieces. And so by the time we get literate witnesses into the area to actually walk back and forth, aside from these two guys, it's not the kingdom that it was before. It didn't have the kind of centralized authority. There were provinces had broken loose. That was basically a lot of chaos in the region. And so we don't really get to see Lunda at its height, but with a really good witness. The only literate witness that went to the Lunda capital before the civil wars was Joaquim Rodrigues Graça, who did go there and stayed for a month or two in 1846. In any case, that's sort of the story of Lunda Empire. Now, how did this empire come to be? Well, darn, see, I can't see my slides ahead. So the idea for a long time has been, initially, I should say, based on the oral traditions of Lunda as they were collected in the latter part of the 19th century. A couple of these were done by German visitors, Max Buchner and Pogge. What's Pogge's first name? I don't remember. Paul Pogge and Max Buchner visited in the late 1870s. But the real big guy to visit here was Henrique Dias de Carvalho. He came as a Portuguese embassy, an official embassy to the Lunda capital. He arrived there in 1887. He left an extensive body of research, and for the most part, he's kind of the touchstone for Lunda history. He's the one that did the most detailed recording of it. He recorded many regional histories as well. And so he's kind of the person that told us that. So the idea of the motivation for Lunda to expand is interesting. I mean, first of all, we know that Antonio de Oliveira Cadonega, Portuguese chronicler and historian, writing his work in 1681, tells us that he has heard from merchants in Cassange. Cassange is here. When my cursor comes back, he had heard from merchants in Cassange that on the other side of the Kasai, that river here, there was this place called Muzua, which is an alternate name for the Lunda at that time. And he had some stories to tell about it. But it was far away, and he made that clear. Less than a century later, in 1750, Lunda has arrived all along the Congo River. And it's right on the nose of the Portuguese who know all about this area. And so it's a rapid expansion. Likewise, the eastern extension of the Lunda Empire, Kazembe, founded in 1740 or so, out of that same thrust. So it was really quite a dramatic and rapid expanse. So obviously, you want to know, why is it that we have this major expansion creating this empire, which lasts a little bit over a century before it's torn to pieces? How did that come into existence? So the scholarly consensus for quite a long time was that the motivation was essentially to reach the Portuguese, or to reach the Atlantic and to reach the Indian Ocean. One way going west to reach Angola, to trade with the Portuguese there. Other one going east to reach the Mozambique and to trade with the Portuguese on that side. That was the conventional wisdom, and it was anchored primarily on research into the Lunda traditions that was gathered in the 1870s and 80s. Okay, and on the basis of that, one of the things that Dias de Carvalho noted in his visit account was that the story was that they had pursued somebody named Kinguri. So in the foundation tradition of the Lunda Empire, Kinguri was one of the brothers of the founders, one of the sons of the founder, I guess, and one of them went away and his brothers pursued him. So it was, I call this the pursuit of Kinguri. And although the story itself doesn't say anything about the Portuguese, the story itself just says that the brothers drank a little bit too much and were, kind of loafish guys, and they caught their father and they beat him, and he was so angry that he was going to get them, and they just ran away. There are variants on this story, but that's kind of the version. So that story was the one that Rodrigues Graça heard in the Lunda capital. But there was another story, and that was the story of Kinguri. that was recorded elsewhere. So at that same time, in 1850, people traveling to Kasanje here heard that Kasanje had been founded by a runaway from Lunda who had come to this region. And he had come at such a time that he made an alliance with the Portuguese to fight Queen Ginga, the ruler of this region over here. And those are chronologically really easy dates to establish. Because Ginga's time is known, this was documented thoroughly by Portuguese. This would have been the early 1600s, maybe 1620, if you want to put a sort of a date on it. But in addition to that, Kasanje itself claimed to be descended from the Jagas, and the Jagas were yet an earlier group who had invaded Congo in the 1570s. On the basis of that, historians of the 1960s, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. On the basis of that, well, yes, in the basis of that, historians in the 1960s decided that the Lunda Empire must have started its expansion in 1500 or thereabouts, and that it took them a while to get over to the border when they attacked Congo, and then another branch of that same attack ends up going through Lunda. So that was a conventional wisdom established by Jan van Sina in particular in his book Kingdoms of the Savannah, first published in 1965 in French and then in 66 in English. And probably it was most elaborated by Joe Miller, the late Joe Miller, whose book Kings and Kinsmen made a detailed exploration of the traditions that would link the Lunda Empire to Kasanje. And this map drawn from his book published in 1976. It was a thesis in 1971. And a lot of the guts of this stuff was presented in the Journal of African History in 72. So that was kind of the conventional wisdom in the early 1970s. That is to say that there was an expansion for the Lunda Empire. It followed a route pretty much like this one, pretty much going directly west. Then there were some other variations that Joe threw in from the basis of his research here to make all of this stuff happen, which you see here. Now, even as Joe was doing this work, however, it was being thoroughly undermined in a variety of ways. One of these was that Jean-Luc Veilleux had found an overlooked Portuguese account of a Portuguese embassy to Kasanje in 1756, led by a name named Manuel Correia Leitão. Correia Leitão described Lunda in fair detail based on evidence he'd heard from people that were visiting Kasanje at the time. And he'd also heard that just the year before, the king of Lunda had been killed in a battle. And on the basis of that, he goes over to Dias de Carvalho's traditional accounts, and there's the battle. And he says, this is King Mukanza. Or that's what Dias de Carvalho called him. We usually call him Mukaz, using the Lunda pronunciation. And so he said, well, okay, if that took place in 1755, he looks at Dias de Carvalho's genealogy of the kings, and he says the king expansion could not have happened before about 1700, maybe 1680 or 90. All of a sudden, now we have to look at Caternega, who sees Lunda Empire as a long ways away, and say, okay, that's when the tradition, when the stuff must have happened. It must have been after 1680 and before maybe 1700, somewhere in that zone. So the chronology was totally thrown off. Then, following that, Jeffrey Hoover wrote his PhD thesis, which was presented in 1978, has never been published. It's one of those works of African history that, for the life of me, I don't understand why it hasn't been published. Fortunately, thanks to the internet nowadays, you can easily access it through ProQuest. But back in the old days, I didn't see the thesis myself for years. And in matter of fact, well, anyway, Hoover studied the language. He determined that it doesn't look like Kinguri really fits as a Lunda title. And he put a lot of doubt over the existence of the whole story. And then I challenged it myself in 1981. I hadn't seen Hoover's thesis. I was living in Zambia at the time, and I published my findings in the Zambia Journal of History. For those of you that are going to publish, I recommend that you don't try to publish in a thing that's called the Zambia Journal of History, because this was published in mimeograph. There were all of 30 copies made of it. It ran for 2 issues and disappeared. So I can't say I made a historiographical impact with that piece, although I have to say it did manage to find its way into the footnotes of the UNESCO History of Africa, so that was good. What I did was I looked at the traditions of Kinguri in the 1660s, that is to say Kasanje in the 1660s, using Giovanni Antonio Cavazzi as my source, and he has nothing to say about Lunda. He has nothing to say about Kinguri. The name of the ruler of Kasanje was Kasanji Kakinguri. And if you take the genealogical reckoning that Central African names use, this means that Kinguri was the ancestor of Kasanje. And if Kasanje was in contact, which we know it was, with Lunda at that time, they would have known of that title as Kasanji Kakinguri. So when they decide to take it up, they're going to think Kinguri is the actual founder. Okay. So these challenges were pretty serious. And finally, in 1998, Jan van Sina himself writes an article called It Never Happened, basically throwing the Kinguri story out. Well, so if the Lunda official version of how this went on is to be thrown out, then what is the version? Well, as often happens, while the evidence is thrown out, the thesis still remains. So basically, the idea was they were going to visit the Portuguese. That was their goal. Originally, the idea was chronologically, it made sense. The Portuguese had just really arrived, and Lunda wants to make contact. Now that all doesn't make sense anymore. So we have to go back to the drawing board. All right. So what's the drawing board? Well, here's Henrique Augusto Dias de Carvalho, that Portuguese diplomat who takes his trip to visit the Lunda Empire, beginning in 1884, and finally makes his way there in 1887. So Dias de Carvalho, as I said before, did an amazing amount of research. This is one of the 5 volumes of diaries that he has, which are now in the Arquivo Histórico do Maranhão in Lisbon. I spent a lot of time there in 2018 going through all of these diaries. These are huge volumes and they're massively thick. As you can see, this is the day for the 20th of January, and over here's the 12th of January. Here's the 13th of January. So he has every day he has an entry like that. Then there's the published diaries, which are far from being identical to these. The published diaries make 4 thick volumes, like 600, 700-page volumes. And there are caixas as well. These are boxes, and in these boxes are additional material. And this is the one that really caught my eye. If you're not good on your paleography, it's apontamentos históricos. It's historical notes on the Lunda Empire. Okay. What you can't see in this is when I found this in the archive, it says volume 3 or chapter 3. And I thought, well, this is chapter 3. Oh, I spent months. I have never found chapters 1 and 2. But chapter 3, if you can see here, begins in 1820. So presumably all the stuff that he had in his published book somehow has this original text. And what's interesting about this text is that it's marked up. So you can see he'd written something out maybe in 1886. And then he met an informant, a man named Muizi, at the Lunda capital. And Muizi gave him a lot of new information. So you see there's crossouts and marginal notes and so on. And then again, this text is not identical to the one he published in the 5th volume of his notes. If that wasn't enough, this was the ethnographic novel volume. And it has about 100 pages of what I would describe as a chronicle of the Lunda Empire. This is how I went to go on this thing. Okay, so Dias de Carvalho is an interesting guy. Here's his trip. At the end of it is Musumba over here. Now, what you can't see on this map, because it's too far south, is Kasanje. But Kasanje is just off the bat. Oh, here it is, sorry. Here's Kasanje. Most of the time when people went to Lunda, they went through Kasanje, they went farther south still. But he took this route through the north. All the German guys that came, they came this way. Not that that's a big deal, but he passed through this long stretch here before he got to the Lunda Empire. And what it means was he was actually the first literate observer to pass through this area for anything longer than just a trip. And he had to stop, as you can see, a couple places. The Civil War was going on. His trip was delayed. And consequently, he had long stays at each of these places. Now, on top of that, he had the good fortune to meet one of the pretenders to the Lunda crown. And this pretender was named Chibwis Madiamba. And he met with him shortly after he arrived at this station here. And they traveled together to here and to here. During this time, he was collecting, that is to say, Madiamba, Shah Madiamba was collecting followers. So he had lots of people came and sent embassies to him. And so Dias de Carvalho got to see over and over again embassies where things were discussed. And what was significant about that was that it shows us the way in which oral tradition actually functioned in real life in the Lunda Empire. And a good example of this was during one of his stops, there was a lawsuit that was heard by Shah Madiamba. It was a dispute between the residents of, let me see if I can get it on my map here, of Kadiamba, where is he? Of Kaungula, who was in this region. He was a regional, basically it was a regional province. Kaungula was a regional province. And Chokways, who were people who came down from this way and were traveling this way. And so each side comes to present their case. And the case was given for the Kaungula by a man named Kameshi. And he said Kameshi was a young man, very learned in history, and he spoke with great fervor and dignity for over an hour. What was significant about it was that Kameshi began his discourse by the history of the Lunda Empire. And in this history of the Lunda Empire, he established the relationship between the Lunda kings or emperors and this particular province. So it was the story of how this province was founded, what its relationships were to the Lunda Empire. He also gave the story of what he believed would be the Chokwe version. Okay, so as you can imagine, the Chokwe groups then give their story as a rather different one. But what ends up happening is Shah Madiamba essentially says to them, okay, you're related to each other in this way through these descendants. And for that reason, you shouldn't have a conflict between you. Having said that, then he goes to the details of the conflict. What's significant about this particular case is that it shows you that in order to get status in the court, you had to have a certain type of descent of your founding ancestors. So this is how King Guri gets his way into the Lunda traditions. When Kasanji-based merchants come to the Lunda capital, probably in the 1650s, I say that because the Portuguese established their feira or market at Kasanji in 1659. When they go to visit Lunda, they have to establish where they fit into the Lunda scheme of things. If they have a high genealogical place in the genealogy of the Lunda kingdom, then they have higher status. And so it was important for anybody who was going to be connected to this genealogy. And I think it was a deliberate and intentional connection that they made for the Kasanjis. They had to get a certain place, and it had to be pretty high, which means chronologically, if you look at the tradition, it looks like it's early. And this is what fooled everybody about the whole thing, because the Kinguri story was attached to the beginning of the genealogy. That's why Benzina and Dias de Carvalho and all these guys bought it, because they looked at this as the beginning of their time. And the big challenge that Veilleux made was saying that can't be based on the genealogy. And as it turns out, sure enough, Kinguri or Kinguri type stories show up in a number of other places. Let's see, here we go. Shah Madiamba again. One of them that I just mentioned here is Penday. So this Penday group is here. Now we know from archaeology, little as it is, that the Pendays have been here since at least the 17th century. Their major capital city is a place called Banza Machita, and archaeologists have actually excavated at this place, and they know that's what it's about. Pendays connect themselves to Kinguri, and they connect themselves to this whole business going down here. How is it that the Pendays do this? Well, they do it because they have to have an ancestor that connects to the Lunda Empire at the right place. And because the Pendays are independent, they want to make sure that they do this the right way. And so they're stuck in there. Likewise, VA, all the way down here, it's not even actually on this map yet. VA will emerge. This is a 1650 map. You see that VA will eventually emerge out of here. VA had a story about Kinguri. They too were doing business with the Lunda Empire. So essentially, that's kind of how the traditions work. And that's how we set up for that to take place. It so happens that we are able to refute by other evidence each and every time that Kinguri appears on the score, and also each time a founding ancestor Here's a good example. This region down here, the Luvali region. The Luvalis today have connect themselves to another high-ranking early ancestor named Chinyama, who was supposed to come and found this area, what looks like in the very early period of the history of the country. Well, we have contemporary documents that show us that this was an independent region, and that Chinyama, that title, was the title that was held in this Luvali country in 1790. At that time, it was not a part of the Lunda Empire. But in 1797, another report tells us that it was. So this is a very late addition to the Lunda Empire, and yet their ancestor becomes stuck onto the Lunda oral tradition at the founder's position, making them appear really, really important and significant in the whole process. Okay, so this is a little bit of how we're going to have to deal with this. So obviously, our oral tradition, at least the founding fathers kind of oral tradition, is not going to help us with chronology, and it's probably not going to help us with anything like events. It turns out that titles that happen to be on the periphery of the Lunda Empire get status because they're doing business with Lunda, and therefore they get up in the genealogy. The stories that are told about them they're simply not true. They were sort of constructed out of hypothesis, or who knows exactly how that happened. I mean, that would be interesting to try to figure out, if you could figure out how that process happens. Elsewhere in the book that I wrote, I was able to do this with the Christians of Congo. We can show where they changed their origin story 3 or 4 times during the course of their history. Presumably that could have happened here as well. Okay, so maybe I'd be stuck if that's where I was. Maybe I'd be stuck. Except that there's another portion to the tradition. So I've been talking about the origin traditions and what I would call the constitutional parts of the tradition. So the earliest part of the Lunda tradition actually establishes a constitution for the country. And when I say constitution, it tells us how each province and each territory is anchored or linked to Lunda. And it's a status-based tradition. It's not something that is actually passed down in oral tradition the way we think of it. It's something that's manipulated from year to year, depending on the circumstances. But I wanted to discover, okay, how did the traditions go? Well, following this part, there's then the kings, the list of the kings. Okay, 13 kings ruled the Lunda Empire before 1879. All of our visitors who passed through this region, Poge Buchner is the first one. Poge comes, also Schutz, 3 Germans, plus Dekawai. Their informants tell them there's 13 kings, 13 kings, 13 kings. Okay, that's pretty good. Not only that, but there's a list of these kings and their names. Okay, that's also helpful. And we know how that list works because there was a sort of a cult for each king. When the king died, his capital was abandoned. He was buried at that capital. That capital became, that burial site became then the ancestral shrine for that particular king's spirit. People would go to visit that shrine. And so there were stories about the king that were kept specific to him at his shrine. So if you're imagining what I am, what I was when I realized this, is that essentially we can find out the history of Lunda by looking at what these kings tell us and what are their shrine histories. And Dekawai had done that. He created this chronicle. And I remember looking at this chronicle and thinking, this is 100 pages of data on the kings of Lunda, and nobody really paid much attention to that. So I said, well, what does it tell us? So I have to say that, however, when the order of the kings was being discussed, Buchner rather unhelpfully tells us that he had 16 different lists and none of them agreed with each other. And Schutz said there was another situation like that. And so, you know, and then Dekawai himself gives us 2 different lists. So the order of the kings is not something that's very stable. They all agree on who the kings are. They don't agree on their order. On another project, I'm trying to see if I can sort out, if I can get their order straight. The only king that we can have any confidence is that one named Mukanza, or Mukaj, because he is the one who was killed in battle in 1755, according to the genealogy. And as it so happens, the founder of Kasanje, according to an early tradition, of Kazembe, this eastern extension, here you see him here, we know from near contemporary sources that this took place in 1740. That does give us Mukaz, and that tradition says, collected in 1816, says Mukaz was the guy that sent Kazembe out to conquer this region. Okay, so I said, okay, well, so we've got a chronology, and I started mapping the routes in which the battles which these kings fought. So most of it's about battles. The Lundas were very honest about things. When they lost battles, they said, "We lost this one badly." It wasn't a particularly triumphant one, but the battles were all waged towards the north. If you look at my arrows, it shows it pretty clearly. These were the battles that were successful enough to establish a province. So the first of these, as you see, here's the founding. The takeoff place was this place called Kola. This is where this was the western edge of the Lunda Empire, probably in Karunega's day in 1680. And we see that the first group, this is him. He follows this river up here. He's attacking to the north. This one comes to here, and then zoom, he goes up to the north. The next one comes to here, and zoom, he goes up to the north. So what's going on here? All right, so we can only guess what this movement is, but we do know that Kasongo, this guy, when Manuel Correa Leitão comes to Kasanje, he hears about the conquests that have just taken place, and here's what Kasongo does: goes to here and then zoom north. Already, when when Correa Leitão arrives here, already this region has been conquered, and they have not attacked along the Kwango. So that's a strange thing, You think, well, okay, here they're just hovering right on the border, and instead of driving in, they're going up to the north. In 1767, as you see here, another guy, Penday, makes the attack. The attack is repelled. It was not easy to do, but they defeated this attempt, and Lunda had to stop here on the Kwango. The northern thrust did actually carry them across the northern part of the Kwango River, but here they couldn't penetrate. And then they stop, and the next thing they do is they go to the south. Okay, I'll talk about the eastern expansion in just a few minutes. All right. So what's that about? What's going on? Well, first of all, it's clear that these are the main forces. The kings themselves command these armies, and the kings die in battle when they lose, and they don't win very much. You can get the impression from the Chronicle, again, that they want to conquer these areas, and they can't. These are not areas that have powerful kingdoms either. They're divided into tiny little polities that cooperate with each other very effectively, and the Lunda can't crack it. They're also reputed to be horrible cannibals. They eat people all the time. The Lundas have a real serious things to say about them. They typically call this whole zone just Akwanda, which means upstream. So they're going upstream. Now, I want you to notice something, though. You see that, in fact, the rivers all flow from south to north. That's the story of Central Africa. Everything goes south to north. What they're doing is they're advancing, and then they're going up a river valley. What are they after? Well, what they're after, I think, is, why do they want to conquer this area so much? Because this is a major textile producing area. So Lunda has what I call the Central African Textile Belt. Most of us will know about Central African textiles because of this place, Cuba. Cuba textiles, of course, are famous. You can see them in all the museums. But the fact is that, my phone is ringing. Well, it's a Chinese call. But all of these people are actually famous for cloth making. The Pendays are also famous. Either the Cubas are more famous. But this whole region is a major producer of raffia cloth. And we're not talking about daily life cloth. This is luxury textiles. To give you an idea of how significant this cloth belt was, this region here, around Okanga and over to Penday, this region here was producing export cloth, which the Portuguese used to pay their troops way down here in Angola. And according to customs records in the Portuguese Empire, between the decade from 1600 to 1611, they imported 100,000 meters of cloth from this region every single year. One of the things that cloth from this area was used as was money. So what's interesting about that is that presumably anybody can counterfeit cloth, but you can't necessarily counterfeit really high quality cloth. And if you're not good at making it and you don't have the resources, you're not going to be able to beat it in terms of the cost of making it in labor. Because it's high, really durable cloth, it lasts a long time. So it's good as a monetary thing. It'll carry its, it doesn't wear out quickly. When the Congo Civil War cut the Portuguese off from these sources of access, they tried to substitute cloth from other places, and they couldn't make it happen. It wore out too fast. People didn't accept it. They wanted to have a specific type of cloth. Actually, they called it Songo cloth, which was from this area here. Songo on my map, if you look at it this way, I had two places that looked like they were Songo. Well, I don't have it on this map. All right. One of them was here, and the other one was Cuba. So it could have been Cuba cloth that they were buying, but they called it Songo cloth. Bushongo is the name by which the Cubas are known, and that's how they got to be called Busongos in the Portuguese records. So this is early. This is 1600s. That's a big thing. The other thing is that when Carnega tells us about the trade with Lunda, there's no slave trade. In fact, what they're buying is cloth, and what they're selling is salt. Okay. Now, it's interesting to know that Kasanje had a major salt plant. And so what Kasanje was basically financing its early relationship was with salt versus cloth. But that is going to explain something else for us, which is the Eastern Empire. Okay, so what are the Portuguese doing in their expansion to the east, to Cazembe? Well, Cazembe is documented in a little bit different way, primarily because we know that the Portuguese didn't make contact with Cazembe until 1795. When Pedro João Batista crossed over from here to here, he had to stay for a long time at the border of Cazembe and Mozambique. They had difficulties getting across the border between, not Mozambique proper, but the people that were just between them and Mozambique, the Bisas. And while they were there, they learned the traditions of Cazembe. Those traditions are sufficiently recent that we can be reasonably sure that they were talking to people who had learned about the foundation of the empire, probably from their parents. They wouldn't have been, somebody who was 80 could have heard this story and related it to him. So Pietro Macola has written a history of Cazembe. He makes a nice use of this term. He calls it reminiscences. So he says there's memories, and then there's reminiscences, which is something that you've heard from somebody who was an eyewitness, but you're not an eyewitness yourself. And then there's oral tradition when it's become consolidated. So the traditions that he heard was a pretty straightforward thing. There was an officer, we can go back to our map. There was an officer at Cosa. They had a southern thrust that took over Cosa. This had, guess what, a salt works. It was a major salt works. And from there, one of his followers was ordered to go this direction. And whenever he found something, to take it over. So what did he find? This is the copper mine. This is the copper belt, the Central African copper belt. There are salt mines all through there. Pedro João Batista gave a list of the salt mines, and they run in a circle, or in a group right along here. He didn't mention anything about copper, but there's absolutely no doubt that there was copper being traded as well. We know that copper from down here shows up over here. That's an older trade. So that's what they're doing. So here's my story, right? The Lunda Empire's expansion is not trying to go to the Atlantic to meet the Portuguese or to the Indian Ocean to meet the Mozambicanos. This was that particular project was, you might say, a byproduct. The byproduct of the project, the reason that they did it the way they did was because they couldn't make a conquest. So every time they go north, they get stopped. So they try to outflank them, keep going farther and farther to the west. Okay? And eventually they hit here along the river. They've always known the Portuguese were there, but they took their sweet time deciding they were going to hook up with the Portuguese. That was not their main task. Once they got really stuck here, then they try over here. And then finally they go down here. So that's kind of what I'm saying. And what we're talking about now is, instead of looking at something they want to export abroad, they're actually looking for domestic resources to use internally to Africa. It's not about the Atlantic slave trade. It's not about the overseas trade. It's interesting that that the Lundas really didn't participate that much in the Atlantic slave trade. Daniel Domingos da Silva published an article, it's about 3 years ago now, where he shows how few people from Lunda were involved in the Atlantic slave trade. It's not that they didn't sell slaves. We know they did, but they didn't sell very many of them. Most of the people they captured, they retained internally, and most of their energies from a military perspective were directed towards the north to capture the cloth resources, and to the east, primarily looking for minerals and things like that, minerals, salt, and copper. And that's my story. So I think I've just reached 45-minute point, and I can stop my share, and we can talk about it, or not.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful, wonderful guiding through so much history there. So I want to open it up and invite anyone to either raise your hand in the participants feature or submit questions in the Q&A, and we can sort of have John answer those.
Luisa Barbosa, I got CAR, maybe Carvalho. Oh, Cardoso. Okay, so Luisa Barbosa Cardoso. Yeah, she says that, well, she actually just gives us a little history of what's going on. The Portuguese arrive in 1482, and from there they initiate the conquest of Angola. And the first step was to establish an alliance with the Kingdom of Congo, which controlled the whole region. And to the south of that was other kingdoms like Ndongo and Kingdom of Matamba, which they didn't hesitate to found to give origin to the Reino of Angola, the Kingdom of Angola, circa 1559. So I'm thanking her for putting that addition onto the story. This is all in the book, so to speak. The book actually is completely dominated by this story. I have to tell you, if you look at page count, it's very heavily 16th and 17th century, very heavily Kingdom of Congo and Ndongo and all of that. And when I wrote the book, I decided I was going to make this I was going to throw in everything I had. and the documentation for this region is just incredibly dense and detailed, and it's great, and you can tell a serious history. And nobody had actually done a sort of a panoramic history, so I thought it was worth doing it. Plus, I had something new to add almost everywhere I wrote stuff, so that was another part. All right, so another one is just saying, how does my work set the scene for later observations of the classical work of Victor Turner and of Pritchett and Audrey Richards on the Bemba, okay, who report on social custom. Okay, so the anthropologists obviously have written about Lunda, and Victor Turner in particular has talked a little bit about oral tradition. I think that I have probably taken, I think that, let me just say this way, I think the historiography of oral tradition has moved a little bit past Victor Turner. People like Luc de Hirsch and others have talked about how oral traditions, especially these foundation traditions, are not, they're ahistorical, and they change a lot. And this is absolutely true. And when we can document it, we show that to be true. So that's what we have to do, is sort of modify these things. So I have Margaret Lombe from Zambia. Are you in Zambia now? Well, I don't know. Yeah, I taught at the University of Zambia for 2 years in the early 80s, 79, 81. I never got the chance to go to the Monte Kazembe's territory and everything. And for that matter, I did publish my first article in Zambia on Lunda, in Zambia, in the Zambia Journal of History. Okay, I might know the project of Lunda Museum studied by Nuno Porto. So the Portuguese had, interestingly enough, they constructed a museum at Dondo. Well, they didn't. The diamond mines in the eastern part of Angola drew a lot of sort of capital out to that region, places like Sarimo and Dondo. And there was a beautiful museum that was constructed out there, primarily anthropological and ethnological. The museum had not just artifact collections, but they did other kinds of stuff. The fate of that museum when the Portuguese administration ended was really complicated, but it ended up, I think it ended up in Luanda, and then some of it went to Portugal, and I lost track of what goes on with that now. Is Luanda, the city, connected to the Lunda origins? No, actually, there's no connection between those two words. Words that begin with an LU are simply members of the same noun class, and Bantu languages have a noun class membership. So words are always going to begin with, nouns at least are always going to begin with one of those classes. So it makes a lot of words that look like they're homonymous, but no, Luanda, it isn't connected to Lunda.
So John, we had a couple of questions. I see you're responding to some of the questions in the chat box, but we also had a few come in the Q&A.
Okay.
So make sure that these get addressed as well.
Okay, let's take a look at them.
We had a question here that how does this also speak to or contradict broader characterizations of African history or traditions in terms of states formed through trade, for example, Bayard's extroversion or Cooper's gatekeeper state?
Yeah, well, this is from Aaron DeGrassi. Hi, Aaron. So Aaron and I first met in Luanda back in 2008, I think. And by the way, Aaron's been fantastic geographical work on this region. Yeah, so well, this particular story is in fact not about either extroversion or the gatekeeper state, as I'm telling it. So I think if we had had the Lunda history of the old days, where it was reaching the Portuguese and exporting slaves, that would have been closer to what Bayard was talking about, or this idea of the gatekeeper state. So Lunda was not, for example, kept up by paying out internal resources to an external source. It was, in fact, rather the moving of valuable commodities within the Lunda Empire and accessing and controlling those. So now, as far as the okay, well, that was okay. Wow. Okay, I'm just went. I guess that's kind of answered. All right. So now Joshua Costello was asking me, what do I think was the balance of regional external and explaining it? So that's a tough one, I have to say. I have not really tried to explore the causes of the Lunda Civil War. I think that the internal regional dynamics of the Lunda Civil War are critical to understanding this period. That is to say, the immediate pre-colonial period. And there really hasn't been much work on that. Edouard Bustin is one of the few people who's actually tried to connect pre-colonial Lunda history and its issues with the Lunda as they were received into the Free State and then into the Belgian Congo. There's tremendous amount of information. Dekawai has incredible quantities of information. And what he has, he's collecting from people who were eyewitnesses. That chapter 3 that I showed you on the screen, the people that he talks to, these were people who were alive when those events were unfolding. So he has a lot of information. He not only did he have the African informants, but he also had a lot of Ambakistas, which were basically mixed race merchants community that was from the Portuguese colony of Angola, but was really trading independently. Okay. The possibility of women's role in Lunda. Well,
if we can, I'm sorry, John, if I could just ask you, because I don't think, I'm not sure the participants can actually see the question. So if you want to read them aloud.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, so here's Joanna Davidson asking me a question. Super interesting. I wonder what you think any of your data and reimagining of the story has to say about the possibility of women's roles in Lunda, even in leadership and in trade roles. I'm thinking here of some recent-ish work by Philip Havoc on previously under-recognized women's roles along the Upper Guinea coast. Well, I can't say that much about the role of Lunda women in Lunda, although they did have very, very important roles. For example, the Ukonkeshe, which was supposed to be a moderator on the elections, and the second most powerful person was the wife of the Lunda ruler. She wasn't necessarily actually his wife, she was a positional wife, but she had her own capital and she had her own relationships. I would like to know more about her. Dekawai's notes, to the degree that I've looked at them on this issue, and I did look for them for the earlier periods. I can't say that I have a lot of data on it, but it looks like it's a significant part. The other side of that is that when I mentioned earlier on that when, what's his name? Too many names all at once. Joaquim Rodrigues Graça, the first ambassador to go from the Portuguese territories, he was actually a client of a very wealthy woman in Luanda. And she was so well known in Lunda that she had her own Lunda nickname. Her agents were constantly going out there. What's her name? I'm sorry to say her name has missed me. I keep thinking Isabella dos Santos, who just her husband just died, but her name is not dos Santos.
Joaquina.
Tell me on the phone.
Joaquina.
Okay, so let's go. Parker Shipton. Wonderful detective work, he says. There's a subtext that seems to favor centralized over uncentralized policies. Is this deliberate, or is there a reason for it? If centralized policies can keep peace, as you suggest, don't they create bigger wars? So this is a good point. The people that are actually resisting Lunda and resisting them effectively are these decentralized polities. And I think one of the things that we really have to think a lot more about is, first of all, the fact that there are a lot of decentralized polities in West Central Africa. We find them in Kisama, for example. Jessica Krug did work on that. We see them in the Dembos, and we see them in these Luba-speaking territories as well. The problem for us as historians is that they don't really generate oral traditions because of their decentralization that's particularly useful for us. So we're kind of stuck with that. You know, I think that that's going to be a question that's worth investigating. I'm not sure how we're going to go about doing it, but I think it needs to be acknowledged that the decentralized people. On the other hand, let me just make it clear that when I'm saying they're decentralized, they are, but it doesn't mean that they're not socially stratified. All of these areas are socially stratified. They have elites and they have commoners and they have surplus and all that stuff. So it's not like they're not like anarchies or something like that. They simply have not opted or have not been successful in having one person centralize them. Okay.
So I think if I can just interject real quick. So we've had Tom Johnson has had his hand up for a minute. If I can ask him to
okay.
Ask the next question. So John, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. I've always loved following your work, John. And it brings back memories of my first encounter with Lunda history, I think 32 years ago, reading about Chokwe expansion when Joe Miller's master's thesis was cited in Lunda under Belgian rule by BU's own Ed Bustan. So it's a nice stroll down memory lane. Appreciate that. My question was about the textile belt and the textile industry in Central Africa. What happened to it? I'm kind of can guess that it might have been submerged by cheaper imports, but maybe you can say something more about that, because it seems like there was a major shift in the economic orientation of this part of Central Africa. Thanks very much.
Sure. First, let me just say, in the textile world, cheap is not always better. Once we get past what I might call subsistence textiles, the stuff you use to cover your naked body, then you've got elite textiles, which is the stuff to make people know you're rich. And the advantage of having elite textiles is that you can spend a lot of money on these textiles. And it's not a function of some measure of its quality. It's a function of its artistic ability and so on. So what happens with the Lunda textiles, I can't say anything about the volume of production, but they still make them. Not the Lunda, I mean the Kubas and these, but they still make them and they still sell them to tourists and they sell them abroad. And that industry has never fallen away. The luxury industry never fell away. What has happened, I think, is that, for example, the cloth currency industry was replaced in the colonial period. And I expect a lot of the cloth was circulating as currency. And that type of cloth has to have the characteristics of durability, difficulty to forge, and perception of being, wonderful stuff. It's interesting how much textiles are used in elite contexts in pre-colonial Africa, and still today. You go to people's houses today, they'll have textiles on the walls, they'll have a beautiful rug on the floor. If you think about these as being like Persian rugs, that's probably a good way of doing it. I remember when I was leaving Zambia, this guy sold me a little textile square, and I didn't spend a lot of money for it, and I used it to wrap books or something and moving it. And I abused it hopelessly for like 3 years. And then one day I looked at it and I said, this thing hasn't suffered any damage from all the stuff I've done to it. And that's when I realized because it was a really high quality piece of cloth. So I think that's probably where we're going. Okay, we got another question. Paulo Mueller is asking me, thank you for sharing your notes. My question is about the power dynamics between territories incorporated after battles and the older territories. What kinds of contacts and obligations were there between rulers of these territories? So basically what the Lunda are doing is two things. One of them is they're constantly shifting population around. By that I mean, this is a very sparsely populated region, and concentrating population in areas which are favorable to population is something that elites typically want to do. They do that by capturing people and physically moving them from one place to another. One of the reasons why Central Africa is engaged in the slave trade, is able to engage in the slave trade, is because they have this long-standing tradition of concentrating population. And so you have like these lumps of population. They're along the river valleys. And this is one way of doing it. So actually, this is well described in Corey Lightow's account of Lunda from 1756, where he says they enslave people and they keep them. Right. The other part of that is taking territory over has, I think, more of a strategic value, which is to say you want to control an area which produces something that you need to have, and you can't move the people because the people and the resources are there at the same time. The people that make raffia cloth have to have raffia trees. And the raffia trees are where the raffia trees are, and they're not going to grow farther south. So you can't just move the people and the industry together. You've got to keep the people where they are. And then, of course, there's just the matter of strategic space. Okay, so I think hopefully I can say that. Here's Ethan Key. I really appreciate how you walked us through some of the processes in learning about Lunda's expansion. I also really like how you show the important role of textiles in Central West African economies, politics and military action in a way that might even provide an interesting parallel with the East African Indian Ocean trade in ivory and textiles from South Asia. Finally, a reference to movements upstream. Oh, it bounced a minute, okay. Is helping me think about river systems. Yeah, you know, in West Central Africa, the fact that these rivers, every one of them, they're parallel and they run straight north to south, has a big difference in the way we look at the geography. I mean, I think we're so accustomed to thinking about East and West like it's an export economy that we don't see North and South. And yet when we look at this from the inside, we see, yeah, that's what it's all about. It's really North and South. East and West are accidents. The Lundas expand to the West because they're trying to outflank, go up the next river valley. And they keep getting until they run into something that's new to them. Yes, Parker tells that we've missed Jem Pritchard, which we surely do, and Jean Hay. Okay. So Tim Weiskell asks about the textile belt. Were there textiles other than those based on raffia cloth? Yes, there certainly were. Were local forms of cotton? Yes. We don't know as much about the textiles. I should say I don't know much about the textiles outside of the raffia ones. For purposes of this argument, that's where I got myself involved. But certainly in the Congo and Angola region, there's a cotton textile industry, primarily in the Umbundu-speaking areas, and there's other types of bark cloth industries and grass cloth industries that work in those areas. What makes the raffia cloth industry special is actually just that, the raffia cloth and the skilled workers that make it the way they make it. And I think this is just a matter of mass population, all learning how to do this from young age and then devoting themselves to it. Wow, okay. That was Tim Weiskell, okay. And then Justin Pierce is asking me the slave merchants who had a nickname. Dona Ana Joaquina de Santos e Silva, that's her name. Thank you very much. Yeah, she was a very powerful mestiza merchant and had contacts everywhere. Very interesting story. I think that Oliveira, Paula, what's Oliveira's first name? She got a PhD at UFT a couple years ago. Vanessa Oliveira is working on women in Luanda, and I know she's working on this particular woman's biography. There's a lot of documentation about her which hasn't fully been used yet. Okay, let's see. And then I have from Sarah Berry. Did I answer this? Following your persuasive argument that Lunda expanded in the 18th century to gain control of trading, do you think that the later decline of the Lunda Empire was part of related to the decline of the monetary? I think that the primary cause for the decline of the Lunda Empire was the Civil War. Now, I didn't carry Lunda history into the Civil War period. I stopped my book in 1852, which is at the death of Naweja II. At that time, Lunda was at its height. There was one reign after that, and then boom, the Civil War hits. I would maybe someday I'll continue to work on that topic, or maybe somebody will decide to do graduate work on pre-colonial African history again, and we can get somebody who can go and look at this immense quantity of documentation there is on the Lunda Civil War and sort it out. Unfortunately, I have to say this, the Lunda Civil War story should be the big pre-colonial African story for Central Africa. Instead, it's about Stanley and Livingstone and Red Rubber and all of that. Not saying those stories aren't worth telling, but those are the stories that are being told. And unfortunately, all the guys that are writing this, Thomas Pakenham and these other people, they're not paying any attention to the internal history of the country. This is the big story. And this is the story that's being missed because we have to focus on what these travelers are doing. Okay, Remy Chilumbu has finally gotten her answer on her question to me in writing. In line with textile industries, Lunda's already mined copper in Katanga and salt in Luapula province for trade. How did the coming of other traders, especially Europeans, affect the Lunda kingdom? Further, more Lundas welcomed Dr. David Livingstone in Zambezi district. Why has history forgotten about this important fact? And to date, there is no recognition of our goodwill to help alleviate the problems of Lunda people face today. Well, all true. First of all, I just did address the question of, I mean, why have we forgotten this? Unfortunately, we've forgotten it because nobody wants to work on this. I mean, you know, I taught at the University of Zambia. People were not in Zambia at that time interested in pre-colonial history. I mean, historians who are writing in DRC, as far as I know, the ones who are writing, and I mean, people do hold research projects in DRC that never kind of reach outside of DRC. But as far as I know, there hasn't been somebody really gone and done a proper Lunda history in DRC. Neither do I think it's really been done very much in Zambia. It's harder in Zambia because you're mostly relying on oral tradition. Wow. Okay. Now, with regards to what Europeans, of course, they come in, they take over the copper mines. They take over the salt mines. That's what the whole conquest of Zambia was about getting control of those copper mines. So for sure, that's what's happened to the copper mines. Okay, Catherine DeLuna tells a parallel story. Oh, this is from Parker again. Tells a parallel story about southern, central region, east to west, more to do with the role of hunting and prestige of hunters. That's an interesting point. The much of the Lunda area and south of there is really quite arid, and the rivers provide the water that these guys live on. I mean, I remember flying from Luanda to Lusaka and looking out the window, and it's nothing down there in the ground. There's no roads, there's no villages, there's nothing, but you can see the rivers because that's the dry area, and then you see this green band. And you pass over them every so often. You can do that yourself, by the way, at home on Google Earth, if you want to. Take that same flight. But in any case, in between the rivers, that's where they have wild animals. And so hunting has always been a big part of the life of people in this region. Likewise, fishing. So the protein comes from the river and it comes from hunting. I mean, they raise cattle too. But the activity of hunters has really been critical. Especially because hunters often then turn out to be elite troops when it comes time to fight battles. Let me see, what are we doing? Yscal did that already. Another one from Yscal on salt. Since the role of salt was significant, was there any trade from sea salt from the coast, as in Ghana? I'm not aware of that. As far as I know, the salt was, the big salt mines were Demba in Kisama, and there was one in Kasanje. Those were the ones that were trading into the interior. And then, of course, there were the salt mines in what would be northern Zambia and parts of DRC down there. Okay. No open questions. And okay, I think if there's anybody who has not received an answer to a question that they might have posed to me, you can try again.
Hi there. Thanks for this talk. I was wondering if you could talk, I haven't been able to get my hands on the book yet, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the sources that were there for discussing the textiles. And I was wondering also if there are any material remnants of the textiles besides those ones that exist from the Congo Kingdom.
Well, okay. So as far as ancient textiles are concerned, you know, to tell you the truth, I don't know. You're an art historian, aren't you?
Yeah.
Right. That's what I thought. Okay. We met in Florida
Yeah, wow, that was a long time ago. Thank you.
Well, okay. I don't always remember everything, but I do remember that. Yeah. So the textiles that basically the Portuguese were importing from Congo were from the textile belt. And I mean, they're called Congo textiles in the literature. I would like to see people do analysis of the fibers and find out exactly where they were produced. I think that should be possible. Because I think that a lot of these things that are called Congo textiles, where Congos used them, they had them and they owned them, but I'm not sure that they produced them. Or there's a part of the belt though that runs across territories that were traditionally part of the Kingdom of Congo. So the sources, I mean, Pigafetta is the earliest source that actually describes the production of textiles, and that's from the 1580s. But then there's really not another one for a long time after that. I used a book on the textiles, which is quite a good book, and I could look it up. If you really want the reference, I can send it to you, because I won't be able to find it right now. I can't. Yeah, it was a book written by a woman, and it was written probably in the 50s, and it described the state of the textile belt today. I used her maps to draw my maps. The thing about the trees that are involved in the textile production is it's really clear that these trees are cultivated. And I think that archaeological evidence will eventually be able to give us a little bit more on things like the density and the origins and the time period in which these trees were cultivated. And I mean, they're still around, you know, they got started and nobody's cut them down yet. And they're still in industry. I mean, they're still in industry working with raffia cloth. I'm not sure what the size of it is, or, you know, the story of that. That would be a good one for somebody to work out. I mean, I know that Cuba textiles they're still circulating, and they're not just old ones. So I would think that maybe a little bit more research in the existing collections in Europe of textiles that are called Congo textiles might give us a little bit more information. I think that they probably were distinctive enough that people would identify them. I think that, for example, those Songo textiles that were circulating in Angola as money, people knew what they were because they looked at them and they could feel them and they knew what that was about. And again, I think that would be really hard for somebody to forge without doing as much work as the original person did for it. And they didn't have access to those materials. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but I hope so. Okay, I got some more questions now. What did the battles? Well, so okay, Margaret Lukfasel. That looks like it might be Flemish or Dutch, right? Okay, anyway, thanks for talking. I wonder what battles you took a look like. Well, we don't have a lot of information about the battles except the oral tradition describes them. But I can let me say a little bit about it. So typically, the way wars were waged in the area was that the attacking party would move into the territory of the defending party and build a fortress. The remains of these fortresses are all over the place in DRC. Nowadays, of course, they're all eroded down, but I spent a couple hours looking for them on Google Earth. You quickly realize that it's really, actually, Africa is a really big continent, and going down to, like, say, a level where you can actually see differentiation in the soil requires you to get really close to the ground, and you travel like 10 or 12 or even 15 or 100 miles. That's really not a lot. But I did actually locate one. I located one that Dias de Carvalho mentioned, and he gave the geographical coordinates, and there it was. So these are substantial ditches, and then basically they raid out from there to provoke the people to attack them in a fortified position. And that seems to be the way they basically waged war. Certainly the expansion war, which is described by Correa-Leitão, is moving into a territory, building a fortress, and then capturing people and provoking people to attack them and then defeating them. Another thing that we know was that they did do long range travel to fight. Again, from Dias de Carvalho, not from Dias de Carvalho, sorry, Correa-Leitão, where he talks about how they would take a certain amount of food and they would travel, presumably to achieve tactical surprise. They would travel pretty long distances overnight. And so that would be the way they were fighting. On the other hand, again from the oral traditions, the big wars where Lunda kings were killed in action, these seem to me to be set piece engagements with large numbers of soldiers, but I don't have any idea how they were deployed. The weapons that they used were generally, even until quite late, not firearms. Correa Lighthouse says that the Lunda actually rejected firearms as a weapon, which he said was as an impediment to valor. So they would have used arrows as projectile weapons and swords. I don't see a lot of javelins, but I do see a lot of lances. So a javelin is what you throw and a lance is what you thrust with. Okay, I don't think that iron was a particularly significant part. Oh, I mean, this is Tim Weiskell asked about what's the impact of the introduction of iron sources from Portuguese and later the Dutch. So my understanding was that local production of quality steel was possible in this region. I don't know that we've gotten scientific discussions of specific items that show up to show, carbon content and that kind of thing. But contemporary witnesses as early as the 16th century use the word steel to describe what they're seeing, acer. So I think that they probably did produce a lot of that. I don't see a lot of Portuguese iron coming in trade records in any of this part of Africa. We do see iron traded in West Africa, although that tends to be African iron being traded around rather than external iron. So maybe you know more than me on this one, but that's the way I understand that. Okay, so Remy Chilumbu is back again, I guess. What has made Lunda Kingdom resilient to this day? Other old kingdoms are no more. Shaka Kingdom, Mutapa Kingdom, Sanjay Kingdom, even the Great Leopard rulership, for just a minute, is the core. What is at the core of the Lunda Kingdom? So I think that the Lunda Kingdom's core has preserved its integrity to some degree. You maybe know more about this than me. I'm not familiar with the present day Lunda Kingdom. Edward Bursten is the guy who talks about how it survives in the colonial period. One of the things that's pretty sure, though, is that one of the things that colonial officials in the Belgian Congo and in Angola wanted to do was they wanted to break up, however possible, large polities into smaller, more manageable ones. And they promoted and encouraged people to produce traditions that would make them independent. And I think that has a role to play in how the appearance of the disappearance of Lunda has taken place. Of course, there were people during the Civil War period. I'm speaking now of the Civil War period from the 60s forward that were very much about restoring Lunda, although I don't think they really were able to carry that away as much as they would have liked to. Okay, Andrea Huerta Mosquera. Well, hello, another old friend. Greetings from Mexico. Yes, she just sent me greetings. I was on her committee for her PhD defense. Okay, it looks like I'm at the end of that group. Any more? Yeah. We got a Q&A. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. He asked, did cloth currencies last in the history until the later inflation of cloth currency with longer distance imports and manufactured cloth? This is a really interesting question, and I don't think it's been properly answered. What is the role of manufactured cloth, and particularly when we're talking about the period before 1850? There's a lot of literature of people talking about Indian textiles being brought into Central Africa. The way I've interpreted that, the question of Indian cloth, is that this was actually the Portuguese looking for something to substitute for Central African cloth, which they were cut off from by the Congo Civil Wars on the one side and the monopolization of trade with the deeper Central Africa that was done by Kasanje and Matamba across the Congo River. I mean, they spent forever trying to get across the Congo River, to get their own people across the Congo River. And they couldn't do it until the 1850s and 60s. And of course, by that time, you do have manufactured textiles. But again, I want to stress this point with regards to textiles. It really, you can, if your textile is beautiful enough, you can charge what you want for it. It's a work of art. What do people pay for art? And especially, what do rich people want to pay for art? And so there'll always be an elite industry catering to people who want artistic products of high quality. And I think that textiles are likely to always be in that game, either in their raw form or in their manufactured form. I mean, you get a designer in Europe or a designer in Africa who produces a set of clothing using local cloth and takes advantage of textures and so on that those things have. And, you can sell it for $100,000. I mean, it's just, what's the limit? So we're not talking, I think the big thing we have to remember, we're not talking about day-to-day consumption. We're talking about high-end consumption for rich people. And I think that's what this Central African business was about, even in the 17th century, although the monetary use and other things. And the fact that, I mean, cloth was used as a building material. People built structures, palaces would have structures, and they would line the walls with what I guess we would call tapestries. And you can see Dopper has some wonderful illustrations of those tapestry halls, and then you have verbal descriptions of people going in. And now I'm talking about in Angola, really, and talking about all the carpets on the floor and carpets on the walls and so on. So, I think that's just the way we have to think about the textiles and its competition from textiles from abroad. Okay, now we got some more things. Tim Weiskell is asking about food supplies carried in warfare. Manioc roots is the quick answer to that question. At least that's what Correlai Town tells us. So yeah, they would carry a manioc, and that dried, I guess you would call that dried rations. Exactly. Okay, here's from Miles Larmer. In reply to Wimmy's question and linked to Professor Thornton's paper, the Lunda leadership throughout the 20th century and today has consistently shown its awareness of political legitimization via the origin mills. Yes, it's true. I mean, the Lundas are not demographically big players, I think, anymore in DRC. I would call on Joshua Costello to tell me otherwise. But I think they do have an important role to play in the traditions of DRC, if nothing else. And again, I'm not up to date on what people do. I never lived in DRC. My closest I've been to DRC is to look at it from the border of Angola, or to look at it from the border of Zambia. And in both cases, I've been close to DRC. I've just never quite been there. A lot of DRC people I met when I was in Zambia too. Okay. Wow. Okay.
You've summoned Joshua, so let me actually unmute him here.
Sorry?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, in terms of like Lunda and DRC now, I think they are my sense is they are pretty important on some level, especially in Katangan politics. Like Moise Katumbi is, a national kind of opposition leader and billionaire who's part Lunda. And then the previous Laurent Kabila, his mom was Lunda. So he had the support of the Lunda and the Luba Katanga, which was an important part of kind of his consolidating power regionally in that. So, I mean, I think they have there's some at least symbolic significance, I would say, even now.
And the Lunda-Luba divide still matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't Shombe connected to the Mwatiambo himself?
Yeah, he was his brother, actually.
Okay. Can't get closer than that.
Yeah, it's complex but important, I think. And it's probably, I don't know, maybe Ed Bustan would know more, but I feel like it's connected to the way that the colonial period is really important there.
Okay, so Catherine Pipe is asking, do they mobilize their Lunda identity? Oh, is it? Okay, again, I'm not, I sort of stopped in 1850, folks. And so when I start answering questions about more contemporary periods, I'm speaking out from my personal experience, which is not informed by serious scholarship. And I'm Joshua Costello, who you've just been hearing from. He's doing a dissertation on language in DRC. And he's going to be able to do much better than me. And if Edward Bustin is here, he can do even better than probably both of us. But I do have a question here.
I was going to say,
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to answer the question, but basically, like, for example, like when the Mwant Yav speaks its broadcast, at least in Katanga, and people watch, like there's some, I don't know, it's hard to parse out, but definitely there's some political significance to that Lunda identity, which politicians mobilize, at least on the regional level.
But I don't think it's one of the most mobilized identities.
It's not necessarily. Oh no, I wouldn't say so. It's more like a way to kind of grasp additional regional legitimacy, but it's something they're kind of situationally mobilizing, but not like, yeah.
Okay, Catherine Pipe has modified her question. She says, the question is related to the ongoing discussion with Joshua. I often see it connected to Chokwe with a hyphen. Well, that's a story that has to do with the Lunda Civil Wars. And essentially what the Chokwe do in the Civil Wars is they become, already in the 1840s and 50s, the Chokwe were taking advantage of honey production in their own territories and also their capacity at producing high quality steel, and their hunting capacity. And they began to get a license from the Wadiamps to come into Lunda territory to hunt. And they had pretty restricted activities in the 40s and 50s. But when the Civil Wars began, Chokwe's began doing two things. One of them was they began throwing their weight as mercenaries on one side or the other, and sometimes on both sides, because they weren't necessarily united as a group. And they had a great propensity for attracting or capturing or drawing in women. And one of the things that Lunda's often complained about was the Chokwe's were taking away the women. And then the children of those offspring would be Chokwe. That's sort of how that worked. And I think that this had a big role in the fact that we got to the point where the Lundas became so mixed up with the Chokwe's that we get the hyphen. I'm not sure how that works out linguistically. Maybe Joshua can answer that one for me, but certainly from a demographic point of view, this is nothing that's uncommon, is for women to be captured and children to be captured. And these are the people who are typically kept when they are captured. The capturing group is using that for their own demographic. They're not interested in exporting people like that. It often explains why the slave trade is imbalanced in favor of males. I mean, there's lots of reasons we can give for why that's the case, but one of the things is to capture the productive capacity of the women and the reproductive capacity of the women in an area where population is really important. Okay, let's see. Looks like we're at the present moment, we're in a kind of a lull with regards to questions.
Well, I think this is probably it. We're just about running out of time here, so I think this might be a good place to wind down. But thank you so much, John, for a wonderful presentation and a very vibrant discussion following a lot of great questions. You know, you mentioned Ed. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us today, so to add his perspective to everything. But thank you to Josh and to everyone who's been here to contribute your perspectives as well, and to Tim.
And thank you, John, for bringing pre-colonial history back into. We had a very large crowd. You know? So. I know that it's your mantra. Good job today. So
yeah, well, we really appreciate it. Thank you all for attending and joining us. As I mentioned before, next week we'll be having Nana Oseo Pare talking about the Ghanaian citizen in during the Cold War, and the Zoom link that you used to access today's talk will be valid for next week's as well, and for all of the Rodney seminars this semester. So thank you all.
Great. Let me just say, if you want to contact me and continue discussions by email, my email's easy to find. Just go on BU and my webpage, my site on the BU site, and you'll have an email address from me.
All right. Thank you all.